Welcome, everyone. Just kind of waiting for our speakers to join on our session. Standing up to the surge, virtual nurses help a health system manage COVID. And I'm Lizbeth Wetruba. I'm the Chief Clinical Innovation Officer at Avasure. And this has been a topic that I'm finding myself talking about a lot lately is virtual nursing. And it's just kind of a privilege to potentially be part of the solution to the staffing shortage that's happening right now. So I'm going to introduce our panel today, and it includes Mary Carrillo, Scott Shaver, and Jennifer McGuire from Memorial Hermann. And Mary's the chief nurse. Scott is in IT, and I think I'll get your exact title when the slide comes up. And Jennifer McGuire is a manager, so kind of all aspects of setting up this program. And I just want to get to my, and for those of you that are in this session right now who attended the first session, something we talked about was, or the speaker talked about was gratitude. So I just want to stop for a minute and express gratitude to the Memorial Hermann team because they don't have time to do this. They must have just carved some time out, made some time to share with you so that you can kind of stand on their shoulders if you are looking at standing up virtual nursing and learn from what they learned and maybe be able to do it faster and better right out of the gate. So I'm very excited to turn it over to the team, and I'm just going to share the PowerPoint presentation, and we'll get started here.
Might have to help you here.
Yeah, I can get a little technical support. There we go. And then, so they're gonna kind of take turns sharing each aspect of it. So Scott's gonna start by sharing the technical piece of it, and then I believe Mary Carrillo is gonna talk about nursing practice. And here we go. And Jennifer is going to, if we go to the next slide, we'll have the there. Okay, Jennifer's going to talk about the staffing, which is a challenge I'm sure everybody will have questions about, and then the nursing practice discussion with Mary Carrillo, and then we'll have time for Q&A, and we should be done by quarter to the hour, whatever hour you're at across the country. So why don't you go ahead and take it away, Scott?
Thank you, Elizabeth. I appreciate the opportunity to speak at the symposium. Before we get into the actual slide deck, just wanted to also say thank you to Avasure for having us. They're great partners with us when we started this journey, well, the virtual nurse journey. We've been using them for telesitters for many, many years. But when we started our need for a virtual nurse environment, they were great partners with us. And getting it stood up and getting it operationalized and so forth. So just in the spirit of Thanksgiving, I also want to say thanks to Avasure for what they did and continue to do to help us support our patients and our technical need. So if you'll go to the first slide under the background section, I just want to give a brief, and right now I see a black screen, so I don't know, that may just be me or...
No, I think that's me.
Okay.
Okay. Maybe Sharon, you can run and get our helper again. But I'll get right to sharing the screen. I think I'm just sharing the wrong screen, which is the PowerPoint. Is that better or no?
That's the slide deck, but not the presentation mode where you just see the single slide.
Okay. Slideshow. Is that better?
Yeah, we're seeing the presenter version where it shows the main slide and the next slide. So you may just share a different screen, or you could at the very top, Elizabeth, where it says switch displays. Try that. Perfect. That's it. You did it. All right.
Okay.
All right, so next slide, please. and then one after that. So I just wanted to give you guys just a really brief overture of Memorial Hermann in general, just so you kind of understand the scope and the size of what we are. So we are in Houston, Texas. We're currently the 3rd largest county in America. Oh, we went back to your other display, Elizabeth.
Sorry, Scott.
No worries.
The slides through Remo.
And if you hit that swap display again on top there, because I'm seeing the presenter side.
Scott is teaching me how to swap slides right there. He's taught me how to do that. Okay, I'm not. I was trying to show your video at the same time, but I'm not going to mess with it. I'm just going to.
No worries. So Memorial Hermann Health System is located in Houston, Texas. So we are in the 3rd largest county in America. Our total hospital account, we are a non-for-profit ran by a volunteer board hospital system. So we are private, not profit. We have 17 total hospitals, which include 11 acute care hospitals, a children's hospital, an orthopedic hospital, a couple of rehab hospitals, and a couple of surgical hospitals. We also have 7 convenient care centers, 9 urgent care centers, 4 heart and vascular centers, a neuroscience institute, a half dozen sports medicine institutes, a trauma institute, and our level 1 trauma center, which is at our academic hospital, has been one of the busiest level 1 trauma centers in America for the last 10 years. I think for 7 out of those 10 years, we were the busiest level 1 trauma center in America. And we have a whole bunch of sports medicine clinics around the city. So by far and large, we're a very large private health system. We also actually have I think the honor of being the oldest hospital-based helicopter ambulance system in America, Memorial Hermann LifeFlight. We average about 3,400 missions a year. So we're very busy helicopter program. Overall, we see about 665,000 annual ER visits. We deliver a handful of babies, 26 and some change thousand. We are licensed with over 4,000 beds total for our enterprise. So all this to say, we're a very big hospital system, but we are a local facility. We are all internal. We have our own, everything we do is for the most part internal. Next slide, please. So this first slide is, and I want to be sure I point out that the scale on the left-hand side of that slide is 0 to 10K. The next 2 slides will be 0 to 30K. So this is actually our first surge. This is kind of when we first started really starting to use Avasure a little bit to watch our nurses. This is our pilot program, started during our first surge. Next slide. And then this is our second surge. And you can see there, again, the side scale is much different. So we might have much higher numbers. This is really where we're out of the pilot stage. And there'll be a slide here momentarily that has all of these dates kind of lined up so you can see it better. But I wanted to kind of show you our surge versus our where we were staffing. So next slide, please. And then this is the surge that we are currently in. This data goes up until about 3 days ago. So I cut it off at 10/4. So again, as you can see, we had some good numbers starting back in August, and just continue to stay high for us for several months. So next slide. So I always like to approach, and I should have mentioned this. So I'm the IT guy, right? So I also happen to be a nurse by training, and before that, a paramedic by training. So a paramedic nurse, and then about 7 years ago, I drank the Kool-Aid, went to IT. So I always like to start my projects and make sure we have a problem statement, because a lot of times people will come to me with a solution. Well, what's the problem? Because maybe the problem you're really trying to solve is not the solution you have in your hand, right? So we really try to narrow it down to a problem statement. So these are some of our problem statements we had going back a year and a half ago. So our ICU patients are typically admitted to rooms specifically designed to care for that critical care need. Those rooms typically have either a glass wall or a glass door, or it's all glass, right? So a nurse, without actually going in the room, can see their patient. Well, due to the pandemic, we had many ICU patients that were in non-ICU locations. So like an IMU, for example, which may have had a solid wall, solid door, no window. So the nurse could not visualize their patient. So to simply walk into a room for the nurse to see their patient, they have to get in full PPE. And of course, I'm sure everyone remembers the shortages we were having the first first year or so of COVID with PPE. So we're looking to do anything and everything we could do to conserve that, but also to get to where nurses could simply, again, glance at their patient. Because as nurses, I'll be honest with you, I can look at a patient and go, oh, they look bad. It's a lot you can tell just by visualizing a patient. So we really were trying to solve a solution or a problem of how to get a second set of eyes on patients behind closed doors or out of eye shot or out of eye range of our patients. So we came up with using AvaSure as that second set of nursing eyes. So that's our problem statement. I will discuss briefly the technical discussion because I want to be sure Jennifer and Mary have plenty of time to discuss the staffing, which was a huge consideration, and the nursing practice change, which is even a huger consideration. So next slide, please. So this is the initial timeline from when we first started. So initially meeting was 7/15 of 2020, and we were up and running in 2 weeks. And that includes contract negotiation, contract signing, the whole 9 yards. From the time we first talked to our AvaSure executives and we had our pilot started. I will brag on myself, which I don't do very often. I was fast. 2 weeks is lightning speed, and it definitely helps that I already had been using AvaSure, and we had a very good technical relationship with AvaSure as well as technical understanding on our own end on how it all works. It really played in our favor. But we literally went from no cameras in patients' rooms for COVID to having some up and running in 15 days to start our pilot. So we also did a really neat, towards the end of August of that first year of 2020, we also did a really neat work from home pilot to where we had nurses who, for whatever reason, couldn't come to our central location to watch a patient. So one example is I had an ER nurse at a hospital who went skiing, if I remember right, and broke his leg. He can't work at the bedside. He couldn't, for a good 6 weeks, he couldn't work at the bedside. Well, during that time, he was able to monitor patients from home for us and still be on the clock. So we were able to use that. We also had a few nurses who were under COVID isolation, but they weren't sick. They were just exposed. And this is back in the early days when we were exposed, you didn't come to work no more. So exposure meant you were homebound for a bit. So those nurses were actually able to watch patients for us, not miss work, not burn PTO. So a lot of good stuff happened there. So next slide, please. So just a quick pre-state how we were before we started this. We had what I call legacy cameras. So we had some of the very first generation cameras. We've been with AvaSure for quite a long time, across 12 of my acute care hospitals. Each facility actually had its own server that they ran those cameras off of. There was no sharing of cameras. There was no way to do a centralized location. So each facility had its own server. Each facility also staffed its own teleroom. So they actually staffed their own people, ran it their own way. They even had different processes across the enterprise for how we ordered it. Was it a nursing order? Was it a physician order? Did they even need an order? Each hospital had its own flavor of how their policies were written. So next slide. So what we had to do was basically, first off, one of the first things we had to do is we had to take all these hospitals and all these servers and combine them into one cluster. So we built an entire 14 server cluster farm in our data center. And then first thing we had to do is transition or get these cameras on this new server cluster. So we had to do that. We also had to do camera assembly. You have to configure the cameras at every facility, and we have some teams that do that. We have clinical engineering that does the assembly. I've got network engineering that handles a lot of the DHCP reservation type stuff. And of course, nursing operations. So not just to have people know which camera needs to go to what room, but what our purpose is, and even how the camera is situated, because you want the camera to be in a good location where they can not only just see the patient, but it can see the IV pumps, it can see the vent if you're on a vent, and it can see the EKG monitor. Because I can tell you right now, if I'm on an AvaSure camera, I can zoom in tight enough to read an EKG rhythm off a monitor. I can zoom in tight enough to read the drip settings. I can zoom in tight enough to read vent settings. And our nurses do all that. So we had to make sure the camera's in a good location. Then we also had to, of course, configure workstations in a central location, which we didn't have until this pilot happened, for these nurses to watch these patients. So we did an initial pilot with 4 workstations. We had clinical informaticists there, and they worked on workflows and with both the telenurses as well as the bedside nurses. And there's also some drafting of policies and procedures. Next slide. So our final configuration was a 14 server cluster, as I already mentioned. I had a 17 room monitoring station here at our corporate headquarters. It had 17 individual offices with dual screen monitors. One monitor would show the Avasure clients to see the patients. The other monitor does show our EHR, which we use Cerner PowerChart, because our nurses do document inside of Cerner PowerChart when they're watching patients. There was several teams on the information systems, which fit applications as my team, and client management, cybersecurity, and desktop. All of those guys had to be involved in getting this thing set up and running. We also installed some extra software for our nurses besides just the Avasure client and the ability to see our Cerner PowerChart product. We use VMware as a virtual desktop environment, and so all of our Cerner applications are through VDI. So we had to make sure VDI was on those computers. We also made sure that these nurses had both Outlook and the Zoom client, because we use Zoom client as our internal chat. So we had to make sure, and that's not normal for nurses to have that. So they all got the Zoom, and then they all got ability to go to Outlook, because that's actually how our requests come in for patients to be monitored. And then we had training, which includes the Avasure course, which some of you guys, if you're using Avasure, are probably familiar with. But we use the online Avasure training, and then we did a hybrid version of Train the Trainer and super users. Next screen, please. This is our final distribution of our 100 code cameras across the enterprise. So we have a good handful of campuses across the city of Houston, so we had cameras in just about every facility. Actually, we had them in every facility, depending on the size of the campus and the need of the COVID surge at the time, depending on where those cameras went to. But every campus got a camera. And then last slide, I thought this was kind of cool. This is the red bins, as we call them. So that's actually how we shipped these workstations home to nurses. So if I had a nurse who, hey, I got 2 weeks where I can do this, we had a whole workflow and plan of how to package and ship the entire workstation to their home, and then how to repack it when their tour of duty, if you will, was done, including cleaning it. It would come back to us. Now, red is on purpose, because like all of our biohazard bins in the hospitals are red, right? So this is to flag it when it comes back in. Oh, this is something that we need, because we would actually clean it additionally once they came back to us. So that's why they're red. But that was kind of how we handled the whole home deployment. So I went through that really fast because I want to be sure that Jennifer and Mary had time to speak. But I am done.
Thanks, Scott. So I'm going to shift it over to the staffing part now. And Jennifer.
All right, thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Jennifer. I am the manager of the staffing team here at Memorial Hermann. I've been with Memorial Hermann for about 4 years, and I have 18 years of experience or background in staffing and recruitment. I'm very excited to be here with you all today and share our Avasure story from a staffing perspective. All right, so first, I think it's important to share with you who Central Staffing is and our purpose within the system. Central Staffing, surprisingly, was established about 20 years ago and definitely has evolved over those 20 years. Within the Central Staffing Department, we have a lot of teams that support us. So we have my staffing team, we have an HR team, education and training, credentialing, recruitment. I don't want to say payroll team because that is made up of one person, but we do have a payroll team here. And then we also manage our external agency vendors too. And so what we refer to us as our admin team, and we have about 20 employees within our department. And then we also have our field employees. We have about 1,000 employees, a little over 1,000 employees who work for Central Staffing out in the field and support that network within Memorial Hermann that Scott referred to earlier. And so just to break that down a little bit further, we have about 500 RNs within our pool. We have LVNs, we have about 100 PCAs or CNAs, we have respiratory therapists, and then we also have a non-clinical group that includes medical assistants, PARs or patient access reps, therapy, PTOT speech, pharmacy, pharmacy techs, office assistants, the newly created position of screeners that COVID brought to us. And in that non-clinical group, there's a wide range of employees that we hire. So with that background, this is where we pulled the group of ICU nurses to support and kick off the AvaSure pilot. This was a very tough decision for the group of our CNOs, as these 14 nurses were all supporting bedside at the time of this surge. Next slide. All right, so on my next slide, I will do a breakdown of the different phases of the surges that we went through. And one thing that I can say I've learned is every surge that we've been through, it's a different surge. I mean, some things are the same, but there are a lot of different things that we went through. And so within the second surge, Scott had mentioned how we had nurses that were able to support us that tested positive for COVID. They were able to work from home. They had special accommodations. And so we also had PACU nurses from our surgery units that, we had to decrease surgery schedules to open up beds. And so it created a different group of employees, not just from central staffing, but just from the system as a whole that became available to support AvaSure as well. And so with this, we created education for the CNOs and campus leaders as, how to help identify those nurses. And then once they identified those nurses, making sure they had the right qualifications to function as a monitor nurse, and then what that process looked like so we could get them onboarded, set up at home, made sure they have the correct remote at home requirements. And also what we created was how to activate an AvaSure monitor from the campus standpoint of, certain questions to make sure they met the criteria, how to turn on the camera. And then we also created an end of shift report form. This was a very high level report that covered a couple of different items. One of them was just any technology barriers that they had throughout the shift, if there were any quality concerns, what the current census was, how many patients we had at the time, and then if we had any patients waiting in the queue. Those are just some of the things that report had covered. And then prior to our third surge go live, we did standardize and implemented a resource guide for the campus leaders. Again, just a one-stop shop of a document of, what the expectations are of a monitor nurse, how they activate it, where to go. Scott and his team set up a really good electronic version of how to request for a monitor for a patient. And then we went over, again, the qualifications and orientations for all of the monitor nurses. And then we created an AvaSure resource guide. We had, we had pieces everywhere, and we just wanted to have it in one place so our monitor nurses could use that as a resource. And then just what the expectations of the monitor nurse while they are on their shift. And then here recently, our system clinical education team did an amazing job and did an enhancement of a training and education plan for the monitor nurses. Next slide, please. So this is a breakdown of kind of that we went through and what staffing looked like. So as Scott mentioned, our first surge started around July 30th for when we started the pilot. And initially the pilot just started at our Southeast campus. And then once we felt comfortable at Southeast, we kind of worked out the kinks. We added Northeast and Greater Heights. We had a total of 3 campuses going at once. And within this pilot in the first surge, we had a total of 14 ICU nurses that were supporting us at the time. And we had 2 nurses for day shift and 2 nurses for night shift. And we just did the standard 7 to 7 shift for both days and nights. And as Scott mentioned, all of these nurses were on site at Memorial City. So then we go into the second surge, and that's when we had a lot of employees testing positive for COVID, as I mentioned in the previous slide. You know, the PACU nurses, just nurses were on accommodations because they could not be around COVID patients. And so, and then on top of that, I don't know if you all heard or if you're from Houston, we experienced the Houston freeze. And same staffing setup, 14 nurses, 2 nurses per shift, but we had more of the hybrid staffing model to where we had employees at home and we had employees on site. But a big lesson learned through this was through our freeze, something that we did not think of. We had the grid issues and power outages. And so we wanted to keep our Avashore nurses at home so they weren't out traveling in the ice, because Houstonians cannot drive in ice. And so we had power outage games because the nurse that came on would have power for maybe 2 hours and their power would go out. So we'd have to have someone come back on. And so that was one of the challenges that we faced through our second surge, and definitely a lesson learned. To the current surge that we're in now, again, a completely different experience with staffing. Of the 14, I was only able to bring 7 over. We did a huge ramp up trying to get more nurses to come and support us. Was to do 2 shifts, just to start off with 2 shifts again per shift. And we wanted to ramp up to at least 3 nurses per shift. Well, we were never, unfortunately, able to get to that where we had 3 per shift. We even offered and we increased the bonuses. We still didn't have a lot of traction, and staffing was a huge challenge during this time. You know, there's very different reasons why. A lot of it, you know, they're tired, they're burnt out. Our employees, they're not required to work 4 shifts every week. They are supplemental. They're required to work 6 shifts in a 6-week schedule period. And so it's a little bit different from our, what I call our home-based employees, where they're full-time and their schedules are given to them in advance. And so also, as we're all aware of, what I call agency temptations, we did lose some nurses to just the ridiculous packages that agencies are offering. And so currently, with our surge we're at now, we did bring on a third-party vendor to help support staffing. And so we are able, right now, we have 5 nurses working per shift, per day and night. And our census is around 20 to 22. We made it up to 28 last week. And so we've been able to definitely increase the camera usage with the third-party vendor.
So Jennifer, that's 28 patients, 5 nurses is kind of the max that you've gotten to so far.
Yeah, that's our max so far. Yeah.
Next slide. So, or no?
Yep. And I am going to pass it back over to Mary.
Great. Thank you, Jennifer. Next slide, please. All right. Just a quick introduction. My name is Mary Curl, and I'm the CNO over 2 of our Memorial Hermann campuses, and was the initial pilot site for our Avashore and tele-ICU program. So learned a lot and became the executive sponsor during this transition as well, and have been able to work with this really great team that presented earlier. So this first slide is really going to go through the challenges we face as a nursing team. And so the first thing is that during the multiple surges, definitely the first one, we had this sudden influx of acutely ill patients, many of which had very long lengths of stay. And so our ICUs quickly grew out of their normal environment. And we had to transition into non-traditional ICU settings, such as the PACU, such as areas that Scott noted earlier, like our IMCUs. And so definitely not the customary areas. And so it really left the staff feeling uncomfortable, given the fact that they couldn't view the patients in the traditional fashion. In addition to that, many of these patients, because they were COVID, had air scrubbers, which were extremely loud. And so it didn't allow the nurse to hear the IV pumps, the vent alarms, anything that's happening in the room. So it didn't give them not only the visibility, but also the audible alarms that they were used to hearing. And so it really left them feeling helpless and not able to support their patients to the depth that they really wanted to. And so we identified this very quickly to put this in place so that the staff could really feel the support. In addition to this, because we saw such a quick influx of patients, not just the acutely ill, but just overall the COVID population, most of our campuses outpaced their normal volumes. And so again, we were having to makeshift patient care areas. Many of our campuses utilize outdoor tents to manage even the ER volumes. And so we had to quickly move to a team nursing approach just to be able to staff the additional volume each of our campuses were seeing. In addition to that, because our procedures in many of our campuses came down, we had to utilize the procedure nurses in a different format that they were used to. And so many of our campuses, especially in the ICU setting, had stretched assignments, had staff, but in different formats than the normal model of care that they were accustomed to. And so this allowed us to really support the nurse, allow her to feel comfortable in these settings and to receive the resources she or he needed. In addition to this, as we were rolling out the process, one of the big barriers that we identified was staff buy-in. They were very concerned with who was viewing them, and they saw this more of a surveillance of their work, which was quite surprising, and we didn't realize we were going to run into that. But they really had that big brother effect where they felt like somebody was looking over them to see if they were doing their work, instead of really seeing this as a resource and a support for them to provide safe care. And so really, we had to work at the very beginning on scripting so that the nurses felt supported in this process and understood that this was really an addition to the care that they were providing, and that this was going to provide additional support. In addition to that, because they were working with somebody in a remote location that they were not comfortable with or familiar with, we really had to work on that trust and that relationship. And at the very beginning, that was one of our areas of focus, is how do we build that relationship quickly so that both parties, not only the monitor nurse, but also the bedside nurse, would feel comfortable in this relationship and really utilize this product or this pilot to the full potential. So that was definitely an area that we worked through. And lastly, education. We identified this as definitely an area that we had to focus on. And Jennifer went through this in full detail in her prior slides, but it was definitely an area that we continued to enhance through every surge and made it even better. One of the areas that we identified as a gap was which areas did we really need to roll this in? Was that ICU, IMCU, med-surg, and then we needed to gear the education towards that. And also educating to a new model. So no longer was that nurse the only one responsible for that patient, but there was another pair of eyes looking at that patient and really working to keep that patient safe. And so really trying to educate not only the front line to this new model, but also our monitor nurses who are used to working at the bedside, now being our second pair of eyes. So really gearing them to look at their patients differently and to help support these nurses. In addition to that, we had to make sure that we not only educated the monitor nurse and the bedside nurse, but all the other key stakeholders. And we found out quickly that if we did not do this education, then the process had breakdowns. And so we had to make sure who we call our OAs, it's our operations administrator, or in some hospitals called house supervisors. They're the ones that really oversee after hours and on the weekends, just overall care in the hospital. And so we had to make sure we looped them in so that they knew what was going on. So as escalation processes occurred, they would be looped in. Next slide, please. All right, so this next slide is really focused on what did that monitor nurse really focus on. And again, this continues to evolve for us as we continue to grow in this project, but these were our initial areas of focus. We wanted to make sure that our critical care patients were being provided safe care, and that our nurses felt comfortable that they were still giving the care given these off-service areas. And so one of the areas that they focused on was physiological monitors, being able to zoom in and look at the arrhythmias and be able to proactively notify the nurse if they saw any type of change in any kind of cardiac rhythm. Also looking at vital signs. We had many situations where nurses were notified because they saw a deterioration in the vital signs, whether that was a heart rate that was decreasing, and we were able to get assistance and support to that patient quickly. Medical devices, I shared earlier that it was very hard to hear medical devices. Not only did we have to keep these doors shut because they were COVID patients in COVID rooms in these non-traditional areas, but also with the air scrubbers, it was very difficult to hear vent alarms, IV pumps, vapotherms, BiPAPs. And so we had to make sure that somebody could visualize that. So again, that was another area. Then, as y'all all know, one of the areas that we're always concerned about in a critical care setting when you have patients vented or even on BiPAP or vapotherm is making sure that one, they remain intubated, but also making sure that they keep that mask on their face so that they are receiving the oxygen needed. And so that was another focus, to make sure that there were no self-extubations, and if there was any concern that the patient was starting to become restless or confused, that we could get the nurse in quickly or some type of resource in the room quickly. Also looking at falls and looking at lines to make sure patients were pulling at lines or becoming confused and trying to get out of bed. So again, that was another focus. And then lastly, one of the key areas was IV medications. One of the things we heard from the nurses is because of these stretched team type of assignments, they weren't able to get into the rooms to look at some of these things as quickly and as often as they normally would. And so we had a second pair of eyes looking at IV medications to make sure if it was titratable medication, that they were monitoring that, as well as just making sure that the bags were not running dry and that they continued to run. So those were some of the main areas. Again, we continue to enhance that to look to see some of the areas that we're looking at future tense is vital signs, and seeing if that monitor nurse could even look at vital signs and documenting that, or nutritional intake. So we're definitely looking to improve that, but these are some of the areas that our front line said were the most concerning to them, and these were the areas that we focused on. Next slide, please.
I'm trying, Mary. Sorry about that. There we go. The last one.
Thank you. So these were just some of the lessons learned as we went through these multiple surges. So very first one is communication is key. We identified that at the very beginning, that if we didn't have strong communication with all key stakeholders, that we saw breakdowns in the process. And so we had to make sure that we communicated many different ways, many times, to ensure that everybody was communicated well. This didn't just apply to just the rollout itself, but this was even shift to shift between monitor nurse and bedside nurse, charge nurse, making sure that the charge nurses were kept informed on the daily progress of patients being monitored. And then even our leaders, whether that was the main process owner for the campus or the OA or health supervisor. So we just had to make sure that that communication was top of mind. Then we also identified that it was really important for that handoff to occur at the shift, beginning of the shift, between the monitor nurse and the bedside nurse. To really identify, not only is that monitor nurse going to focus on those areas that I spoke to in the prior screen, but what are the top 3 areas of concern that that nurse has for that shift for the patients that the monitor nurse is looking at and monitoring. So to make sure that in addition to those, that they're really focused on whether that is they had a really unstable patient that the vital signs were really critical to monitor, or whether that was a patient that was very confused and we knew that that patient was going to get out of bed. And so we had to really keep a close eye on that patient. So really making sure that that communication happened every shift, because as we all know, that could change shift to shift with each patient. Then another area of opportunity was escalation. We found, because of these stretched assignments and this team nursing approach, that there were times where the monitor nurse tried to get a hold of the bedside nurse, and she might be tied up with another patient in a code, in an RRT. And so what was that next step of escalation? Because what we found is that the bedside nurse would become frustrated because they didn't get a phone call, but equally that monitor nurse was trying to reach that nurse who was already tied up. And so we had to quickly put in a process to make sure that we had strong escalation process in place to escalate to the charge nurse, and then further even to the health supervisor or OA if the bedside nurse and the charge nurse could not be reached, to ensure that at the end of the day, the resources reached the patient and the concern was addressed. Then also creating a triage process for patients in the queue. As the others noted, we had issues with staffing, and so we had patients in the queue at various times where we needed to really monitor that and make sure that we were triaging and get those patients that had the highest critical need on those monitors, as well as making sure that we were de-escalating those monitors. We saw early on that we had patients placed on monitors, and as long as they were in the ICU setting, they just remained on the monitor. And there was opportunity to de-escalate some of those monitors off to allow others to come on as we went through this process. So really just teaching the monitor nurses to be able to monitor that queue, to talk through whether we had patients on the monitor for continued time or new requests, to just identify were these really appropriate asks, to make sure that we were really offering this opportunity to our highest risk patients. And then really creating a pipeline for staffing. As Jennifer noted, staffing was definitely a challenge to this because we had competing priorities. These same 14 nurses were also at the bedside prior to this pilot. And so we had to make sure we utilize other resources as well, because at the end of the day, we needed everybody at the bedside that we could as our numbers continue to increase during the various surges. And so we looked at different opportunities, looking at workplace injury or illnesses that nurses could still work from a virtual format and help in these areas, but couldn't necessarily be at the bedside. And so we utilized those nurses. Also nurses with maybe accommodation. So we had some nurses that were pregnant were at a stage where they weren't able to provide as many shifts at the bedside, but could pick up those additional shifts watching our patients through the monitoring. And so again, just looking and creating a pipeline. We also looked at, as we went through various surges, how about those nurses that are now in administrative or educational roles? Could we bring them back to the bedside and train them? And Jennifer alluded to some of the additional training that our education team built, so that we can really transition these nurses back. But again, depending on the volume of the surge, and this last surge was pretty significant with our critical care, you know, that's also some of the areas where we had opportunity because we just did not have a strong enough pipeline. So this is definitely an area that we will continue to focus on, is making sure we have the staffing to fully effectively monitor any patient that's needed. And I believe that's the end of my slide.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Mary. That is the end. And this was, I wish we had more time, but we are basically out of time. But would you be willing to share some of your documentation and workflows? Because I think that would address, we have so many questions in the Q&A.
Yes, definitely. And we're happy also, I'll be happy to share my contact information if any of the various hospitals would like to reach out to us individually as well and talk through some of this. We'll be happy to share.
Okay, let me see if that, is that on the last slide?
Yeah, I'm more than happy to share my email address.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thanks, Scott and Mary, for that generous offer. So if people reach out to Officer, we can kind of make that connection. And I wish we had more time to talk, but thank you for taking the time today. And I'm sure this conversation is going to continue. And the next presentation is in 15 minutes. and that is about workplace violence prevention using video monitoring. Providence St. Peter's Hospital has implemented a really great toolkit and published on it. So they're going to share how they're tackling that very relevant issue as well. So thanks, Scott, Mary, and Jennifer, and everybody that was listening.